Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to a new screencast lecture. Today's topic is Introduction to Energy. This is a neat picture. If you take a look at this is clearly the United States and also Mexico, and you can see that there's different parts of the country use more energy than others. So you can see here, especially in the East Coast here, right here, what city is that? And over here, you can see much more energy use, bright, and here there's not nearly as many lights. So you can think about what states you're going to find here and why aren't there as many lights. And here's another photo. This is a world photo. Now you can probably figure out that this is not a real picture. It's a composite of different photos because you could not take this picture. You can't see the entire world from one perspective. But you'll see that certain countries, certain parts of the world are definitely lit up more than others. And there's certain countries that aren't lit up very well at all. So here's Australia. Why is this area not very well lit? Okay, who needs energy? Well, everybody does. Everybody needs energy, and some people use more energy than others. What are some ways that we use energy here in the United States? Well, let's take a look at it by sector use. Now, by sectors, I would mean one sector would be transportation, for example. So we use energy for transportation. We use energy in our homes. That would be residential. We use energy in our businesses, and that would be considered commercial. And then we use energy to build things in our factories, and that would be considered industrial. So let's take a look at what area uses the most energy. Do you think it's going to be transportation? Do you think it's going to be residential, commercial, or industrial? Well, here's a graph that shows you that. Now, the number one energy use in the United States is going to be industrial. And then after that, you're going to go with transportation, residential, and then commercial. Go ahead and draw this quick graph in your notes. So in our homes, we use energy for different activities, and we could take a look at those. And how would we rank these categories? In other words, I'm saying which one of these categories do you think uses the most total amount of energy? Well, I'll go ahead and let you think about this for a little bit. You can pause it here and rank it like, oh, I think refrigeration's number one and lighting is number two, something like that. Go ahead and try that. Okay, here we go. I'm going to go ahead and give you the answers now. The seventh greatest use is going to be cleaning, so it's going to be primarily your clothes dryer. One easy way to reduce the amount of energy used for your clothes drying is to use a clothesline. So hang your clothes up outside and to dry it in the sun. Electronics, that's going to be your computers, televisions. Refrigeration, that's keeping your food cold, your milk in the refrigerator. Air conditioning, lighting. And number two is going to be water heating. That was, to me, was kind of a surprise. So when you take a hot shower, warm bath, you are using a tremendous amount of energy. And then finally, space heating. So just keeping your house warm in the winter, that uses a tremendous amount of energy as well. Okay, let's take a look at energy use from a historical perspective. So how has energy use changed over time? So these people over here in the year 1090, how would they use energy differently than we do here in the 2020s? So like, for example, we use energy to do certain things that they may not have even dreamed of using. Like, for example, flying airplanes, computers, cell phones. So we use energy for a lot of things that they would not even have had access to. What about how do you keep your food cold? So 100 years ago, most people did not have a refrigerator. You know, nowadays we have refrigerators, or even some people who have television screens on the refrigerators. The refrigerators can tell you, what foods you need to buy at the grocery store, or things like that. Refrigerators like that certainly were not available 100 years ago. In fact, a lot of people may not have even had a refrigerator at all. They might have had what's called an ice box. And it's basically just a big cooler. And you see here, they have their meats, eggs, milk, and then over here there's a big gigantic block of ice, and you would close this like you would close your refrigerator, and you'd call this an ice box. So this caption down below, it says this brand new ice box would hold 75 pounds of ice. It came complete with a drip pan and a large storage capacity. And if the ice block is getting low, the homeowner would contact the iceman, And the Iceman would show up in his wagon, and he would have a big block of ice that he would carry. And here's the ice wagon that would come to your house. You can see back here, the guy carrying a big block of ice. And where did he get these big blocks of ice? Well, you might remember the movie Frozen at the very beginning, where the guys were cutting the blocks of ice at the beginning of the movie Frozen from the lake, and that's actually true. I mean, people would actually do that. So here's a photo from Indiana where people are cutting blocks of ice off of a frozen lake and stacking them over here, and they're going to use that to sell so people can keep their ice boxes cold. The opposite spectrum, you want to keep your house warm. It's too cold, so you would use something like this. We all have gas furnaces or electric furnaces to warm our homes. Pretty simple. However, 120 years ago, people would not have that convenience. So you would probably have something like this. You would have a truck who would come by, and there would be a chute, and they would dump coal down the chute, and it would go down into your basement, and you would store a big pile of coal in your basement. You may have seen rooms like this if you've ever been in the basement of an old house. There's the basement. You can see the basement looks kind of creepy, and then there would often be another smaller room, and that would be the coal room. And you would have the coal delivered through a window or a little door, and it would just pile up in your basement, and that would be your storage of coal. And then what you would do is you would take a shovel and you would put it in a coal stove like this, and this could be used for cooking and also for keeping you warm. And here's a model of this in a museum where kids nowadays, we can kind of play at shoveling coal. Probably was not nearly as fun back in the day when that's what would help you keep you warm, but nowadays we can kind of find that interesting and play doing that at the museums. Now, we talked a little bit about how energy use has changed over the past 100 years or so. What about way further back, 1,000 years ago? So things were definitely different 1,000 years ago. And even then, people would build homes, they would build churches, just like we do today. But they would use machines, and maybe something like this, where you would have people walking almost like on a hamster wheel to lift heavy objects. They could use animal power to help lift objects and blocks for building. People had to farm for food. Nowadays, we use tractors and things like that. Back then, people might use animals to help plow their fields. Cooking. People still need to cook. People still need to eat. Nowadays, of course, we use stoves, usually electric or gas. Use an oven, very convenient. Back then, things would be a little bit different. Maybe you'd cook over an open fire. And that fire often would be made with firewood, like in this case. Instead of using firewood, here's an interesting way that people use to cook food and to get fuel. This is in an area where there's not a lot of trees, so you're not going to have a lot of firewood, but there's a lot of grass, and there's a lot of cows that would graze on that grass. And one of the byproducts of the cows eating grass would be this. So these are actually big cow patties. This is manure, and that manure is flammable. So here you can see this woman cooking these loaves of bread on a pile of burning manure. This is burning manure. Yum. Here's an article I came across. Could cow manure be the future of green energy? I don't know. What do you think? If you guys would like to use cow poop to cook your food, let me know in the comments below. Do you think that total energy used worldwide has increased or decreased over the past 1,000 years? So in the year 1020, for example, how much total energy was used by humans versus in the year, say, 2020, how much total energy is being used? So do we use more now? Do we use the same amount as we did back then? Or did people 1,000 years ago use more total energy than we do today? Well, it's increased, and it's increased by quite a bit. What could be a couple of reasons why the total amount of energy use has increased over the past 1,000 years? Well, there's two main reasons. The first reason is that there's simply a lot more people nowadays than there was back then. So the more people there are, the more energy needs there are, the more consumption that's going to be happening. Here's a graph showing world population growth through history. So let's go and take a look at, say, the Stone Age, so 5000 BC, so roughly 7,000 years ago. There were, looks like, probably about maybe 8-9 million total people. And over time, as you get through the Bronze Age, that would be like the ancient Greeks, the Iron Age, 1000 BC. So we're in the like the Roman Empire time around here. You can see the population growth is growing a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. And then you hit this point about here when all of a sudden population just skyrockets. And here's a graph. This is a little easier to see because this is not nearly as long a period of time. This one starts in 1750. So at this point, there's less than 1 billion people in the year 1750. The first time there's 1 billion people, looks like it's somewhere around here, around maybe 1820, 1830 is the first billion. And then to get to our second billion, it's almost probably around maybe 1930, 1940 to get to our second billion. So from 1830 to 1940, so it took about 100 years to go from 1 billion to 2 billion people. What about 2 billion to 3 billion? Well, 2 billion to 3 billion would be about here, so about 1970. So 1970, 1940 to 1970, that took 30 years. That's certainly less. Now we go from 3 billion to 4 billion. That only took another maybe 10 years. And then nowadays we're adding 1 billion people every few years. So that's exponential growth of world human population. Something just fell off the wall. So besides that, there's more people, meaning more consumption, we also use energy in different ways now than we did then. So technology, for example, is much more energy resource intensive than some of activities were back in the past. So like, for example, transportation, riding a horse versus flying an airplane. It takes a lot more energy, oil, fuel, things like that to fly an airplane. You don't need a whole lot of that to ride a horse, or certainly walking, you don't need to use oil or anything like that. Using a backhoe to dig a hole uses a lot more energy and technology than using a shovel. This is an interesting graph. So individual energy consumption over time. So if you were a person who lived, say, 7,000 years ago, you as a person, the amount of energy you used, most of the energy you used was you just eating food. You can see that amount hasn't changed very much. So we eat a little bit more now than people maybe did 7,000 years ago, but that amount of energy has remained relatively stable. However, areas that are significantly different would be, for example, transportation. We use this amount of energy for transportation versus, again, 7,000 years ago, just this little sliver. Cooking and heating, people would not use nearly as much then as they do now. This little picture is kind of showing that this one individual person is using way more fuel, way more energy than, say, an entire family would have 5,000-6,000 years ago. So we can see that as humans, we use much more energy in our daily lives than people did who lived 100 years ago. So here's a group of boys from 100 years ago. Here's a group of kids nowadays. These kids use way more energy than these kids did back then. Plus, these kids had to work in a factory or a mine. That's pretty rough. These kids go to school. So you guys, hey, I don't want to go to school. Wow, 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 wow. I'm sure these guys would have loved to have gone to school instead of the factory. Now, are there any ways that we may use less energy for certain activities today than we did 100 years ago? And then explain your answer. Think about that for a moment. So yes, we can use less energy nowadays than we did in the past. And a way to do that would be to make our technology, to make our machines more efficient so they don't waste as much energy. And what I mean by that is, like, for example, a great example would be a light bulb, where using a regular incandescent light bulb, the bulb gets very, very hot. The purpose of a light bulb is not to heat the room up, it's to light up the room. So an incandescent light bulb gets really, really hot versus an LED that lights up the room, does not use electricity to make heat very much at all. It's much more efficient. Other areas that we could see that, like, for example, in the 1970s, cars averaged less than 14 miles per gallon versus More recently, cars in the year 2008, they averaged almost 23 miles per gallon. So that's a much more efficient. So we would use less fuel now to drive a mile than people in the 1970s. And people in the 1970s, they would use more gas to drive the same distance as we would do today. That's pretty good. Where do we get the energy that we use? What are those energy resources is the term that we're looking at. Energy resources is a topic that we're going to study in more detail very, very soon. But let's take a look at world energy resources. What are the most common places that we get fuel to make energy? Well, number one by far is oil, sometimes called petroleum. We also use a lot of natural gas, and we use a lot of coal. Some other energy resources that we don't use nearly as much of, that'd be hydroelectric, that'd be like water and a dam, and it would use the running water to make electricity. Nuclear fuel would be another way we get energy and electricity. And then finally, a very small amount would be some of the things like solar energy, some of the more recent energy resources that people are using, sometimes called non-renewable versus renewable resources, which again is a topic we'll talk about in the future. And around the world, you could see that all of these different resources, the consumption is generally increasing over time. So nuclear energy, hydro energy, natural gas, coal, oil, all of these areas we're using more and more different energy resources around the world, and a lot of reasons for that. And of course, probably number one reason is that there's a lot more people now than there was in the past. The United States, we're doing it too, so we're using more energy over time, still using the same kind of things: oil, natural gas, coal, and those uses are increasing over time. Again, not surprising. Electricity is something that we use all the time. Electricity is great. However, you don't just dig electricity out of the ground. You need to get it, you need to produce it somehow. And the number one way that we here in the United States produce electricity is coal. And then after that is nuclear, and then natural gas, oil, water power, and then renewables like solar and wind. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit in the future. Ohio is a little bit different than the country as a whole. You can see that Ohio gets almost all of its electricity by using coal. Something to think about: what is one reason why it is not surprising that oil uses coal to generate electricity? That's something for you to think about, and again, we'll talk about that in the future. If you have an idea, comment below. All right, guys, that's it. So hopefully you learned something, and we'll catch you next time. See ya.